Hi, everybody. I'm Santita Jackson. This is the Santita Jackson Show on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota, streaming live on am950radio.com, the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel. Everybody, please like and subscribe there and meet me on my Facebook page, the Santita Jackson and Friends page. Now, that's the only page I've got, everybody. You might see Santita Jackson. I can't accept any friends there. And I do want you to be my friend, giving my love to Reverend McAfee and Gary Hines and Spike and all the people, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar and Senator Amy Klobuchar and so Keith Ellis. And oh, I've got a lot of friends up there. And I'm sending you all our love. And of course, from Chad Larson and Brett and everybody at AM 950, my love to you and our love to our listening audience. Please tell everybody about us and go to the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel, the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel, and the Santita Jackson and Friends Facebook page here on AM 950 Radio broadcasting to you. You know, Reverend Jesse Jackson said many years ago that slave masters never retire. They never retire. And apparently they do not. You know, as we are literally while we are watching this, and I would remind you to click each link if you want to see this Morning Stars. Click each link for each hour. I saw something that was just absolutely stunning. And that really shouldn't have been that stunning because I guess he said Mark Fancher, Attorney Mark Fancher, National Conference of Black Lawyers, and of course, Attorney Robert Patillo from the National Leadership Team of Rainbow Push. I guess Eric Prince said the quiet part out loud. Wants to recolonize Africa. I want you to call. I want you all to just let that settle in on you. I want you to reach out to me. Let me know what you think about that. Let me know what you think about him on his podcast. Now, who is Eric Prince? Eric Prince, of course, Blackwater, renowned, famous, infamous mercenary. He is calling for the U.S. to colonize Africa and Latin America. He has a growing podcast. It's growing in its popularity. It's called Off Leash, and the Intercept reports this. Eric Prince has been many things in his 54 years on Earth. The wealthy heir to an auto supply company, a Navy SEAL, the founder of the mercenary firm Blackwater, which conducted a notorious 2007 massacre in the middle of Baghdad, the brother of Betsy DeVos, of course, Donald Trump's Secretary of Education, shadow advisor to President Trump, and on and on and on and on. And last November, he started a podcast. And in last Tuesday's episode, he said the U.S. should, quote, put the imperial hat back on and take over and directly run huge swaths of the globe. And I quote, if so many of these countries around the world are incapable of governing themselves, it's true, it's time for us to put the imperial hat back on, to say we're going to govern these countries, because enough is enough. We're done being invaded. You can say that about pretty much all of Africa. They're incapable of governing themselves. Now, his co-host warned him that listeners might hear his words and take exception to it. He said, people on the left are going to watch this and they're going to say, wait a minute, Eric Prince, you're talking about being a colonialist again. And he responded, absolutely, yes. He then added, he thought it was a great concept, not just for Africa, but for Latin America. Mark Fancher, I know you are chomping at the bit to get to this.
Yeah, you know, on the one hand, it's stunning in that he would say it out loud. But on the other hand, it's not at all surprising because this is and has been the mindset for a great many people in high and low places, in white communities in particular, primarily because of the history of white supremacy and what it has done to the mindset and the thinking of people around the world, both white and of other colors. And there is an enduring and continuing belief at the most gut level among many that white people are superior, that in every way, intellectually, artistically, culturally, and ethically, that they are superior to others. And because of it, you have someone like him saying this, and it's possible, I don't know the man, it's possible that he doesn't even have any malice, that he actually, in his own mind, may regard himself as benevolent, because when he looks at the world, he sees white civilization, which is wonderful and good and sparkling, and he sees others, and all of them are inferior and pathetic because of their own inadequacy, because they are not up to the level of advanced white people and their superior ways and their superior thinking. And for him to suggest to himself that, yes, the thing to do is to go back and to colonize these regions, is not just to our benefit. It's not just to the benefit of the U.S. empire and all of the profits and all of the gains that come from maintaining an empire, but in some ways it's a Christian duty, that we are in some ways helping all of these populations because they are so inferior and helpless. And I think that, to an extent that many of us who are people of color don't recognize or understand, this is a very common way of thinking. Uh, I live and work in the state of Michigan, and the Flint water crisis, which everybody knows about, was really a byproduct of legislation that's on the Michigan books called the Emergency Manager Law, which allows for a governor to appoint an individual who's elected by nobody, to come in and to take control of the machinery of local government. And that's what happened in Flint, and they made some bad decisions and things. But the point of this story is that when the emergency manager law was first being considered in the legislature, and I looked at it and I thought, wow, this is extraordinary.
Mhm.
And I began to talk to people who I presume to be progressive in their thinking, people who I thought would immediately become as alarmed as I was about this. I was stunned by the reaction, because many of these people said, well, yeah, I see what you're saying. Intellectually, this is inconsistent with what the Constitution is all about, and what the country is all about. But at the same time, some of these communities, they just really need some help. They need some people to come in and to take control of them. And as it played out, and as I'm sure they were contemplating, the emergency manager law became a very racist law, because the only communities where emergency managers were appointed were communities that were predominantly black.
Mhm.
And so it's a way of thinking that is not limited, to this one man, but it's more pervasive than people consciously realize. And many of the people who think this way don't even realize that that's the way they think, but they do.
Hmm. Robert Patillo, what do you make of these remarks? The
Um,
sentiments.
one of my favorite things about this post pandemic era that we're in is that everyone has a podcast now. So now you get to hear from former athletes, for example. You hear stories from the locker room that you never would have heard before. We hear from musicians about things that happened on tour that you never would have heard about. You almost get a window into people's real thoughts. And for some reason, when people get on podcasts, they just start talking as if there's not other people listening. It becomes a very intimate conversation where people let things out that normally they wouldn't let out. And here, we've seen this often in conservative media because they really spearheaded this kind of digital media and podcast movement. They'll start saying all the white supremacist stuff that they have always thought, but they never would say it out loud because they understood that there would be repercussions if you go on Fox News and just openly say things. So before they would always say, well, we're here for merit-based education. Now they openly say, I'm against diversity. They would always, have like a little buffer there where they wouldn't say that. What we hear from Eric Prince is what we hear from a lot of white people, not just in America, which is the more concerning part, but globally, which is that they believe it is the white man's burden, fundamentally, to civilize the rest of the world. And that when they, after 500 years of raiding, pillaging, stealing the natural resources, enslaving the people, they see these countries around the world and say, all they really need is white people to come in and run it. If you look at what's going on in Haiti right now, after nearly 300 years of oppression from Europeans and American forces, now you're hearing Americans and Europeans saying those people are just such chaos. We should go down there and just take over the government and run it for them the right way. They, in their minds, think that they're doing something benevolent, when in reality, they're continuing 500 years of colonial exploitation of the rest of the globe. The reason that these countries are in the situations that they are in is if you take several million people out of their population and enslave them, if you take the natural resources that are worth trillions of dollars and appropriate them for yourselves, if you murder millions of their people in the name of colonialism, if you spread European diseases to them over the courses of centuries, well, it's going to take a little while to rebuild after that. And Eric Prince is simply saying that he's saying the quiet part out loud, which is that we need to continue the American empire. Not that we need to restart the American empire, because the American empire never went anywhere. Just look at the bases that America has around the world. Just look at the soldiers that are stationed. The only time we find out exactly where our troops are stationed is when they die. When the troops in Niger died in 2017, we said, we have troops in Niger? When the troops just died a couple weeks ago in Iraq, we all of us said, we still have troops in Iraq and Jordan and Syria and Kuwait and Lebanon and every other place around the globe. In reality, the American empire has its tentacles in every part of the globe. All he is simply saying is that instead of being a shadow empire, let's just pull the banners out, pull out the crowns, pull out the jewels and everything else, and just do it for real. And I think that the rest of the world needs to understand that this is the prerogative of these people, and we have to be ready to fight back against it.
Well, I mean, there's been no hue and cry, no sound of alarm, Mark Fancher. We're joined by Professor Niakwete. We will be pivoting to him in a hot second, but no one has said anything. I mean, it was on the podcast, and there you go.
Yeah, because it's not an idea that concerns or bothers anyone except people who are the prospective communities of the colonized. And this has been really the agenda of the U.S. empire, continuously since the first time that they set foot in Africa, since the first time that they set foot in Central and South America, since they set foot in the Caribbean. I mean, it has always been the objective of the empire to dominate as much of the planet as possible. And the only thing that has changed is the method that they've used to do it. And so the idea of sending in ground troops and staging invasions and raids and things like that was later replaced by covert activities that were carried out by the Central Intelligence Agency and other organizations that lurked in the shadows because the U.S. lost its taste for sacrificing its young men and women on battlefields. And it was working hand in glove with neocolonialism, which is basically just a fancy word for saying Uncle Tom's in high places, where they put black people in as heads of place black people in position of heads of state in these countries, but they pull their strings like puppets and tell them what to do, while these puppets allow for outside forces to come in and to pillage and raid and rape the country of all of its natural resources and its wealth. And more recently, the method has involved the use of entities like AFRICOM or U.S. Africa Command, where U.S. military personnel are essentially functioning as advisors, lurking in the shadows, but directing operations carried out by the armies of African countries for the benefit of the U.S. empire. And there's also technology, where we've seen an increased use of drones to carry out armed attacks that kill and devastate in missions that in the past might have been carried out by fighter pilots or by ground troops. So this is really par for the course. And for him to say that we should get involved in recolonizing Africa or recolonizing Central America or South America, in some ways is old news. The only thing novel about it is that implied in his comments is that we should go back to doing it the old-fashioned way, where we just sort of pushed our threw our weight around and went in there physically with ground troops and doing whatever we wanted to do and daring anybody to try and stop us.
And just
Mm-hmm, Robert.
sorry, just real quick to piggyback on a point that Mark was just making. We seriously need to start taking a look at America's robot army. That sounds like an insane sentence, but America has pivoted to UAVs and unmanned vehicles and autonomous vehicles to replace a large part of our ground troops and our ground forces. Just this week, a program called FARA, the Future Advanced Reconnaissance Helicopter Program, was canceled. The U.S. government had already invested $2.8 billion and invested in developing this new futuristic stealth helicopter, and they canceled it because they realized they could get the same thing done with drones and unmanned vehicles. We're investing in new stealth drones, the Predator drone, even the new B-21 Raider will have a semi-autonomous mode, meaning that you can pilot the entire jet bomber intercontinentally without anybody being in the cockpit. The new Booker tank, which is supposed to be a smaller variant of the M1 Abrams, will be autonomous. They have the loyal wingman system that goes with the F-35, where you can have one F-35 coordinating an entire squadron of lethal drones that are that surround it. So when Mark talks about this, our use of drone warfare, America has doubled and tripled and quadrupled down. And we're going to be seeing in the next several years armies of American robots literally taking over countries and then sending in the American ground troops thereafter simply to be able to hold the ground and govern the populace. But the idea of a one country having a robot army that is unkillable, that can take life and death in the hands of autonomous vehicles should scare everybody. And we have invested tens of billions of dollars in that simply because they understand that they cannot continue to get young minorities to sign up to go die in their wars, but they can build enough robots in order to make up for those ground forces. And part of what the reason that we're sending so much money to Ukraine is we're testing all of that stuff against the Russians right now in Ukraine. We're doing high-valued R&D versus their weapons to find out exactly what works. Switchblade drones, kamikaze drones that are being put into action, the use of other UAVs, and we're in a dangerous point. We're just about, we're not quite to Terminator territory, but we're about 20 years from that.
Let us welcome Professor Niakwete. I met him many years ago when he was working hand in hand with Randall Robinson at Trans-Africa. He's one of the foremost professors concerning Africa. He's an African specialist. And of course, Georgetown University, many of the great universities of the world. He's native of Ghana, but we claim him in the United States too. And we're so glad to have Professor Niakwete with us today. And I want you to respond to Eric Prince. We have, of course, these two brilliant analysts, attorney Mark Fancher, National Conference of Black Lawyers, brilliant civil libertarian and civil rights lawyer, and of course, brilliant civil rights lawyer and part of the national leadership team at Rainbow Push, and host of his own show on WAOK every Sunday from 1 to 4 Eastern Standard Time, attorney Robert Patillo, someone who's been with Reverend, I guess, since you were in undergrad, attorney Patillo, before you had a beard.
Absolutely.
Before you had a beard when he looked like a little baby. But Eric Prince said that so many of these countries around the world are incapable of governing themselves. It's time for us just to put the imperial hat back on. We're going to govern those countries because enough is enough. We're done being invaded. You can say that pretty much for all of Africa. They're incapable of governing themselves. And he went on to include, as his co-host on his off-leash podcast, pushed back and said, hey, I think you're crossing the line. And he said, no. I'm including Latin America in that too. And this is on, as we find out, I think that 40% of the wealth, at least, is controlled by the BRICS nations. I mean, they're going to absolutely swallow up the Western world, Robert Patillo and attorney Mark Fancher. I mean, that is happening. The de-dollarization is happening. And yet you have someone like Eric Prince, someone who is extremely connected and a very influential and powerful figure who is saying the quiet part out loud. Professor Quentin, why don't you react to what you've heard?
Well, good afternoon to you, Santita, and my dear brothers. I do apologize. I was wrestling with the technology, and it took me a while, but I'm so glad to be on. I actually, truth be known, I was twisting Santita's arm because I did want to take part in this, even though I'm a bit under the weather. I agree with everything I heard. Now, I'll touch on two things. I mean, broadly, when I read the transcript, and I was sent a short video, but I also saw the transcript of Eric Prince. It seems to me that his number one issue, actually the bigger point he was trying to make, is this quote unquote invasion on the southern border, and he just threw in Africa at the end. Now, I'm not an expert on Latin America or immigration into the US, even though I am an immigrant. Yes, I was born in Ghana. I was born in the Gold Coast. And since he's talking about imperialism, I think it's important to state that I was born several years before Ghana became independent. I remember our independence ceremony. Dr. King was there. Richard Nixon was there and called him Mr. Mayor. Dr. King came back and preached about how inspired he was to see Africans taking back their country and their destiny into their own hands. It humbles me to think that Africa contributed a little to inspiration for Dr. King. So I want to be brief on Latin America part. Of course, I mean, I'm a part-time professor of international relations. And so I look at other places in the world. And so what I know about Latin America is, number one, Eric, I mean, I actually think some friends and I have reacted privately to what he said. And many people were saying, look, this is so ignorant and so laughable. We have better things to push back on. No one will believe this. Let's leave it alone. On the other hand, he is very well connected. His sister, Betsy DeVos, was Mr. Trump's Secretary of Education.
Yes.
And he is listed as be advising Mr. Trump. And so I'm sure that his podcast is gospel to the followers of Mr. Trump. So given that, I mean, what he's saying makes no sense, but it is toxic. It makes no sense to people who are minimally informed. But I decided that any opportunity I get, I should push back on it a little bit. Not that such people will believe me, but there are other neutrals who are wondering whether what he says is true. So even on Latin America, this is my point. Number one, what invasion is he talking about? How does he define invasion? He's a military man. He was in the Navy, so he ought to know better what invasion is. These are refugees and immigrants looking for a better life. Number one. Number two, if in the United States, and again, I'm no expert in this area. I'm on Africa, but if you are in the United States and you want to talk about invasion, you ought to go back to the 17th century, okay, when the Americas were invaded by people from Europe, okay? So there's a difference between refugees looking for a better life and people coming with arms and guns and ships and trying to take over. That's what Europe does. And in that sense, the US is an example of European colonization. So this is not an invasion. And in any case, I have read a couple of books that I will advise Mr. Prince, in case he's interested in the truth, to read. One of them is called The Fruits of Empire by Juan Gonzalez, which is fairly recent. There are other books about how Europe colonized Latin America, I mean, North America, Central America, South America. That's what invasion is. Okay, so to me, it makes no sense to be talking about invasion if you are concerned with the border. And I do think was concerned with the border. But, the mainstream media has been terrible. So they say, okay, we saw one or two Africans among the people trying to get in from the Mexico border. So that's why he threw in Africa. And then he went into Africa and he touched on Africa. And his point there was he sort of switched gears and said, well, African countries are not well governed. Their people are not well served. The leaders are corrupt and they go shopping in Paris. Well, I'd like to tell him something. Number one, African countries are not perfectly governed. African politicians are not perfect. But I know of no country today or ever in history that has been perfect or had perfect leaders. But if you take that as a problem, then we have to diagnose the problem. Is corruption the problem? A couple of facts. Several experts have measured the level of corruption by Africans. They put it at 3 billion US dollars, three with a B, billion with a B dollars. But there's also, that's not the only corruption in Africa. There is another level of corruption measured at 100 billion with a B, corruption in Africa. That is corruption mostly by Western countries, even though China has joined in and they rip Africa off in all kinds of ways, but typically of powerful countries, especially the West. Do they call that corruption? No, they call it illicit financial flows. So I've had graduate students who say, oh, I don't know what that means. So they hide their corruption. I can tell you, I hate corruption in Africa. I'm from Ghana. Right now, we are dealing with corruption by the current government we have, and it pains me because every dollar stolen from projects hurts poor people. And I come from a very poor family. When the roads are not well made, trucks and lorries and cars crash. I've had people close to me who have been killed in such instances. Corruption is deadly, but the point is two things. Corruption by foreign countries, especially Western countries, ripping Africa off since independence is far bigger. The UN has measured it. The African Union has measured it. Again, it is 100 billion each year. So if you are concerned about corruption, let's look at those facts. And secondly, as I think Attorney Mark was saying when I got in, the leaders we have in Africa, and I say, oh, they are no good. They are all puppets of the West. They are all puppets of the West. I mean, one quick example, a friend called me and said to me, shame on you because Paul Kagame was here for the prayer breakfast and you didn't even notice. And I said, no, I've been sick because, we have 55 countries. So many of them don't have democracy even on paper. Those who have it on paper, it's not working well. So I'm saying, so the worst leaders in Africa are all supported from outside. If you think about it, why will the people of Ghana or Nigeria or South Africa or Egypt or anywhere else support a dictator that's bad for them? African dictators are supported by outside powers, majority of them by the West, okay? I mean, Mr. Biden talks about authoritarianism, a competition between authoritarianism and democracy. I like that because I know democracy is difficult and it's not done perfectly anywhere. But as an African, I can tell you, we don't have time to go into that, maybe another show. I can tell you, I am convinced to my bones that we need democracy that works, okay? It may not, it will have weaknesses, but we need to keep pushing at it because there is no other system of government that I believe is good for us. And basically, by democracy, I mean the will of the people. If you want to govern any African country, the people of those countries have to agree to it. So my point is, Western countries pay lip service to democracy, and then they turn around and support corrupt dictators, and that's why they steal so much, because they have people helping them. to do that. So basically, I think Eric Prince does not know what he's talking about. And my final point is this. So I'm saying his diagnosis is wrong. But of course, there is a problem. His diagnosis is wrong. His therapy, his solution, it's even worse. He wants imperialism, recolonization. And this is why I started the way I started. When I hear people talking about imperialism and colonization in Africa, I feel like they are aiming directly at me because I was born into the British Empire. When I was born before 1957, I was born into the British Empire. If if being part of an empire was going to solve Africa's problems, we would be the perfect society because the British, who learned their imperialism from the Romans all the way back, and they built an empire that they said the sun did not set on. They did all kinds of things, and I can tell you anything but imperialism. And if we need imperialism, the British are there. They built a big empire. So I am saying Mr. Prince has no idea what he's talking about, but he knows his audience that they are going to believe him. And I will stress the first part of my answer, which is that I think he's concerned because it's in the news. I live in Washington, D.C. This is all over the news about concern over the Mexican border and immigrants, and they use incendiary words like invasion. So that's where he started, and then he, for somehow, got this idea that he should throw in Africa. He is deadly wrong, in my opinion, on both sides. It would have been good to just, I sent Santita a note and I used the word reasonable because what he's saying doesn't pass the laughter test. It doesn't pass the straight face test if you have minimum understanding of international affairs, of U.S. relations with Latin America. Definitely, if you have any idea about U.S. relations with Africa and European countries' relations with Africa. But the people that is aiming at don't know any of that. And if they embrace it with U.S. elections coming, this is what I think makes it very dangerous because they might say, oh, yeah, we are going to try what he said. He's whispering in powerful ears, and we will pay the price if they take him seriously. So I was telling my friends, no, we have to find a way to push back. And the last quick point, all that he's talking about, this imperialism, the point is it has been tried before. They have tried it in all parts of the world, from India all the way to China. They did not colonize China completely. They tried to take over. Britain led the way with the opium wars, of course, and then they took over the island nations, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Burma and others. So they nibbled at Asia because Asia is huge. They couldn't swallow it, but they swallowed New Zealand. They swallowed Australia. They swallowed South America. They swallowed Central America. They swallowed North America. Notice I haven't mentioned Africa yet, because with Africa, what they did to us, and given who I'm part of in this, I know Santita and my brothers, we all know this. They hammered Africa with Atlantic slavery for 3 centuries to soften us up. And then after the heroic work of enslaved peoples in Haiti and United States and other places, even Brazil, when slavery ended in 1884, what did they do? They returned, they called a conference. Slavery ended in the mid-19th century. So they returned to Africa to colonize us because they had softened us up for 3 centuries with slavery, taking out all the best part, shattered our customs, our resources. They did all that. And so they swallowed Africa. But the great part of it is, yes, I'm very proud of the little work I was able to do on the Nelson Mandela issue when I was at Trans Africa. Because for us, the fighting apartheid was part of the decolonization of Africa issue. And my point is, after that, those 300 years of hammering us with colonization, I mean, with slavery, and they came back and colonized us, chopping off hands in the Congo, doing all kinds of horrendous things. Africans, after they used us in the two First World War and the two World Wars, Africans who have fought came back and said, no, now we have to liberate ourselves. And Africans who have had the privilege of studying to higher levels, and I'm talking about Kwame Nkrumah. And when I say that, I bow my head to African Americans, because everybody, don't take my word for it, take Julius Nyerere's word for it. He will tell you Nkrumah was so great because he went to school in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
He was radicalized by the African Americans, and Julius Nyerere died a devout Catholic. So he doesn't use the name of God lightly, but he said, I went to school in Scotland. Kwame went to school in the United States. He fell in with the African Americans. They radicalized him, and thank God that they radicalized him. Mm-hmm. So when he came back, his idea, people were saying, oh, we need independence at some point in the future. Okay, for now, just self-government. He said, no, independence yesterday. He was in a hurry, and he pushed, and he helped other African colonies, so that his statue at the African Union in Ethiopia was the only one there for a long time, because he's revered across Africa. And I'm saying we owe the thanks to African Americans.
Absolutely.
That we liberated ourselves. So I'll pause it there, but I don't think Mr. Prince knows what he's talking about.
No, but I think that Reverend Dr. Yeri, part of the national leadership team at Rainbow Push, and of course, the senior pastor of the Douglas Memorial Community Church, the iconic church in Baltimore, Maryland. You heard what Eric Prince said, and you just heard Professor Akwete. And of course, you've been listening to Attorney Robert Patillo and Mark Fancher. I want you all to react to this history lesson that we have gotten from Professor Akwete. Trans-Africa, Georgetown University, so much. Indeed, he's one of the world's most renowned African specialists. Dr. Yeri.
Well, good afternoon, Santita, and to my colleagues, to Professor Akwete. Wahotasan.
Yeah, thank you.
Good to be with you.
Good to hear you, yes.
I think there are a couple of points. One, the history that the professor has laid out is important for us to keep in mind. That this is not a new thing, it's just a new version of a thing. There has been considerable interest in the assets and resources of the continent for as long as there's been attempt to trade with the continent. There's been this ongoing assault on the integrity and viability of culture and government and community and language groupings, groups for as long as we can remember. If we study the history of the hostility to the African continent, this is not a new thing. It is just a new version of a thing. As the professor has laid out, what started out as quote unquote trade, trying to figure out how you got from Europe to Asia and having to go around the Cape and how all that was dangerous. And then there was this interaction with sub-Saharan Africa in the process. And then they realized, as the professor has laid out, he was born when it was called the Gold Coast. They realized that it wasn't just a stopping point, it was valuable land. And so the destabilization, the intentional destabilization of culture and clan and group interaction has been part of this process from the very beginning. We cannot lose sight of that. And so it's in that view, from that lens, that I look at Mr. Prince's comments. There's a motivation behind it, and it has nothing to do with strengthening the integrity of government and governance on the continent. How would someone who has ties to and runs Blackwater, he's got a corporate interest in doing what Robert Patillo has said, moving to a distanced control. We saw it under President Obama and the use of drones, remotely controlled from underground bases in Colorado on the mainland. They are using computerized site identification to be able to know how to navigate. And so what this is a warning to say, guess what? The African continent still has high value. There's high market value for the greed that has fueled the imperialism that the United States has learned from Europe and has taken on a practice in a way that even Europe didn't rise to be able to figure out how they're going to control it. And what they've done is they've created a synergy between dissimilar things. What's going on the southern border somehow has some ties to, quote, corruption in African governments. Here's what Nigeria is a member of OPEC. Let's be clear. Let's be real clear that the gold that is still there in the ground in what we now know as Ghana has value. We know that the mineral value of the diamond mines in South and Southern Africa has a lot of value. The timber that we find in sub-Saharan Africa, the cocoa that we talked about yesterday, all of those things have a particular value. And if you can control it, it's much like we've seen in other places. If we dominate you from a distance, then we can claim that somehow or other we discovered that there was some vast richness here and that the people had no interest and we just came in and found it. And so you can't hold us accountable for the injustice and the death and the horror and the pillage that we've imposed. Forget what you've studied in history, because we're trying to take that out. That's somehow critical race theory to talk about the Congo Conference in 1884 that says, here's how you identified which piece you were going to get. First, you had to claim an economic interest, but then you had to have the military wherewithal to defend it. And if there were a dispute between competing nations, guess who was the mediator and the arbitrator? The United States. And so let's not lose sight about how this thing went down. This is just a replay. And because you have such an ignorant population, I'm not saying they're stupid, they're ignoring the history, They can then run this hustle on folks who will buy into somehow or other there's a dysfunction on the continent of Africa that needs to be remedied in the name of just governance. It is a farce on its face. And we who know the history and know better about the history, shame on us if we don't do as the professor has said. We don't push back against this ignorance that is being perpetrated publicly and without shame.
Attorney Fancher, indeed, that is why the breaking of Gaddafi, the killing of Gaddafi, who really stood against the recolonization of Africa, who had really was establishing one currency, one Africa, someone who was uniting Africa, someone who predicted his demise during the Obama administration, sadly, as he started watching really that imperialism had not stopped. That imperialism just had not stopped. It was on a forward march. And so getting AFRICOM in there was so important. And everybody who heads up AFRICOM is Black. I mean, why do you think it's important or noteworthy that Eric Prince said this quiet part out loud at this time?
Well, it's let me say this. You know, when Barack Obama went before African heads of state and wagged his finger at them and said that they needed to work on ending corruption in African leadership, I thought to myself, Negro, please.
Mm.
I mean, because really, I mean, the U.S. thrives on corrupt African leadership. I mean, an honest African leader would be a Gaddafi. It would be a Robert Mugabe, but the honest leaders, the ones who take a look at their countries and say, you know, Africa really should be for the Africans. Africa's wealth should be for the Africans, and it should not go into my pocket. It should go into the people's pocket. It should not go into the coffers of foreign corporations. It should go into infrastructure for the people of Africa. It should be used for Africa's progress and development. Those are honest leaders. Those are leaders who are not corrupt, and those are the ones who are demonized. Those are the ones who are regarded as enemies and terrorists and all kinds of things. So it's odd that Prince would mean what he says, if he does mean it, because America, the U.S. empire needs corrupt African leaders. It needs corrupt Latin American dictators. It thrives on them. They're central to the success of their operations. And the proof is in the history of it, because, when Robert Mugabe, who was one of the co-leaders of the Patriotic Front that waged the struggle against apartheid in what was then called Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, as they were nearing the end of the war and they were negotiating at Lancaster House in England, the question of land came up. And so the Patriotic Front said, we're planning on taking the land back, And the response was, no, you can't do that. Yes, we can, and we will. And so a deal was struck where the U.S. agreed to buy it back, or to make sure that it was bought back. That was under the Carter administration. Ronald Reagan was going to have nothing of it once he succeeded him in office. And so the land was never paid for by foreign sources. And when the veterans of the war came to Mugabe and they said, we want the land back, and he agreed to take it, then all of a sudden things changed. What people forget is that in the immediate aftermath of the birth of Zimbabwe, and Robert Mugabe was prime minister, he was lauded and applauded by the Western world. They said that this is the type of leader that Africa needs. This is a wonderful man. He's got integrity. He's got this, he's got that. I mean, he's competent, he's intelligent, he's educated, he's credentialed. This is the model African leader. He started talking about taking white people's land, and all of a sudden, I mean, faster than you could blink an eye, this man was Satan on earth, and he remained that way until his death.
Santita, forgive me. May I just throw in a quick anecdote to support my brother?
Yes, I've got about 3 minutes left.
Okay, please forgive me, but Robert Mugabe taught school in Ghana. The first lady of an independent Zimbabwe was a Ghanaian woman, Sally Mugabe, because Robert Mugabe admired Nkrumah so much that he came to Ghana to teach. It was when he returned to Zimbabwe to show his Ghanaian bride to his parents in around 1961 that he saw that British veterans, people who had fought in the Second World War, who didn't have jobs, were being brought to Zimbabwe and say, you can take all the land you want, and that is fine. My brother, everything he has said is correct. The first part of Mugabe's rule was 10 years. And they praised him and they said, oh, please, don't do anything yet. We will give you the money to buy the land. He waited 10 years. During those 10 years, he was an angel. When pushed by the veterans and he said, no, now we need to take the land back, all of a sudden, he became a demon. So everything my brother is saying is true. In Ghana, we regard Robert Mugabe as our in-law. Sadly, Sally Mugabe died, and he remarried. So my point is, Ghanaians are very keen about their relationship with Robert Mugabe and what went on there. And everything my brother said is true. African leaders who try to help their people are demonized. Margaret Thatcher once said about a Ghanaian leader, oh, this man is dangerous. Why? Because he thinks that the resources, the gold in Ghana, should belong to Ghanaians. That makes him dangerous. That's what Margaret Thatcher said.
Well, in furtherance of his point, we had the privilege of knowing, we had the privilege of knowing President Mugabe, and in furtherance of your point, Professor Puente, and yours, Mark Fancher. And I'm going to give you closing remarks when we come back on the other side. The Queen of England loved him, thought he was such a cultured and lovely man. This teacher, this professor, I mean, because teachers in that part of the world are so esteemed. And of course, Mark is from one of the iconic families of teachers in Black America. And we're so grateful for your family's work, Mark. Well, as soon as he did what Mandela did not do, and that does not take away from Mandela, because we love Mandela and his struggle. But Mandela didn't ask for the land. Mugabe did. As soon as he asked for the land, those teas that he used to have with the Queen of England, they stopped. She refused to see him ever again privately. I got 30 seconds for you, Mark.
No, I just want to say his experience is not unique. It happened to Mugabe, to Gaddafi as well.
Mm-hmm.
There was a period when Gaddafi was the darling of the West. But when he started changing his tune, then the same thing happened. And he came to his tragic and horrific demise as a result of being disemboweled by a bayonet, by a mob that was armed and directed by the U.S.
On camera. Stay right there, everybody. Stay tuned for the second hour of the Santita Jackson Show here on AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota, as we talk about the West attempt to recolonize Africa and Latin America. Will it work? Do you not get it this time? Back with more of the Santita Jackson Show in just a few minutes.